Nos vimos 3 o 4 veces por toda la ciudad. Una noche en el bar del Loro me decidí a atacar. Tú me dijiste 19. No quise desconfiar. Reflejada
Hello. I need to close the live.
Stand by for the introduction.
Okay, so let's start. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second day morning session. We have a special guest from Paris. Valeria, are you in Paris right now?
I am in France, yes. I am in Marseille.
Okay.
Not in Paris and not near to Notre Dame.
So from Marseille, it's Valeria Siniscalchi. She's a fellow anthropologist, and she's going to talk to us about mobilizations, activism, and economic alternatives. Valeria, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Emilia. Thank you, Alexandros, and everybody. I'm very sorry for this presentation in a virtual way. It would be a more nice to be with you in Volos. So I will try to present you some lines. Do you listen me well? Okay. So I will present you some lines to analyze the spaces of experimentation that are created by different forms of alternative economies from a point of view of economic anthropology. If you look to people who camp for weeks in the public squares of Montreal, or people marching in the streets of Barcelona, or forcing their way into a bank in protest against a housing mortgage system, or again, employees that are assembled in a factory in southern France where work has stopped when the company moved production offshore, or again, the dozen of activists meaning strategic spots at an enormous open-air cheese exhibition in a small city in the northwest of Italy, we can ask, what do these people have in common? Not much at first glance, but yet there are common elements, even if they take different specific forms in different specific circumstances. Sorry for my English, that is half Italian, half French accent. So in some cases, these protests assume mobilizations assume the form of open protest or emerge in situation of conflict where they acquire national or international visibility. In other cases, they are less visible and more diffused, while expressing disagreement with the dominant system or one of its forms. In other cases, they seem to escape to definition of activism. But in all of these case studies, people mobilize against a market system or some aspect of it. And from my point of view, this initiative and mobilization make it possible to see the interweaving of economic and political forces. And in my point of view, analyzing forms of mobilization is also an excellent way to interpret contemporary economic and political transformations. One of the central issues, as we have seen also yesterday, of the present is the reconfiguration of economic spaces, place of production, workspaces, network of exchange and distribution. Probably more than in the past, economic questions permeate society and define people's way of life and the power relation. Oh, sorry, I need to close, otherwise you have otherwise the email intersect with my presentation. Yes, what was saying, economic question permeates society and define people's way of life and the power relations in which they act or to which they are subjected. 20 years ago, Komarov and Komarov observed that this increasing economization of life can generate criticism that could expand the spaces where alternative visions of humanity are imagined, whether in pockets of resistance to capital, in places still free from its hegemony, or within its own contradictory locations. I close the quotation. Indeed, today, there seem to be numerous expressions of new social imaginations in the form of resistance or alternative economies that seek to modify the paradigm of the market system and its associated social configuration, imaginations, and values, and these in different ways and in different places. However, if we contrast the dominant political economy to those new imaginations, as Susanna Narowski alert has, we run the risk of creating dichotomies that can make it hard to understand that those movements and imaginations that social actors and researchers conceive as alternative are in reality an integral part of the capitalist system. We can consider this as a starting point for an analysis of experiments that take place within the confines of the dominant political and economic system. Experiments attempting to resist, to oppose, or modify that system, sometimes in its interstices and sometimes in more visible place. First of all, it's important to look at the evolution of activism, to the new configurations that it can produce, and to its interaction with market logics. In fact, activism encourages people to question the relationships of production and power and the neoliberal economic system more in general, and to rethink forms of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. It's also important to recognize that experiments in new economic and political relationships are not pursued without conflict. And second, the important point is that tensions and conflict are constitutive elements in the process of economic reconfiguration, not only in the arenas where the mobilizations are active, but also within the mobilization themselves. And for anthropologists, the conflict offer a very good ground for analysis. At the heart of many present-day alternative economic projects, we find classic themes and concepts of economic anthropology. I'm thinking, for example, to the work of Mary Douglas and Byron Isherwood, The World of Goods, that was a study of consumption and the place of goods in the process of social and cultural reproduction, including the possibility of using consumption to reject existing cultural frameworks and produce change. And we can find similar issues in the practice of consumption as engaged or ethical, that it's part of some contemporary mobilization, encouraging people to rethink the relationship between the acquisition of goods and the way that this can allow individuals and groups to challenge aspects of the dominant political and economic system. Some movements that encourage alternative economic practices put at the center of their mobilization a new form of exchange and the idea of reciprocity that echoes the idea of Carpolani, for example, and classic works in economic anthropology. These works are incorporated into ideas as that one of human economy, for example, defended by Heath Hart and others, that aimed at reinserting the social and human at the center of the economy. The question of common goods that has been analyzed yesterday during the discussion, the first roundtable, I think, the question of common goods can appear also in urban context concerning the appropriation of spaces and place, encouraging people to address once again the distinction about the interaction between the public and the private, as some historians of right are doing and analyzing, examining the elements that notion of public and private alone does not fully address. Proposed practices relating to things like exchange, production, and property often are presented as innovations, while at the same time they maintain links with past and often idealized practices. I am thinking to the notion of Marion Stuyver, for example, or retro-innovation, that we can apply also to some of these mobilization, where people do things, rethink old practices in a new way. So, also if we, as Susanna Narowski that I evoked before, we need not to create artificial dichotomy between capitalism and other forms of economy that are imagined as radically different from capitalism itself. And it's important, sure, not to succumb to this dichotomization. I think that the ideas emerging from mobilization about economic alternative can help us to understand the internal dynamics of the neoliberal system. And taking them seriously requires that we take account of the social and political values that support or arise from these alternatives and their practical achievement and variations, as well as their coexistence with the logic of the market system. A useful area for pursuing this point is that of food. That is my field of research. Food is both a concrete reality that is intimately linked to daily life and to vital necessity, and it is at the same time a catalyst of mobilizations in domains that range from the environment to the social justice or worker rights. And the notion of food activism provides an analytical framework that can be applied to phenomena and actions at different scales, such as movement with a structural organization, associations or cooperative that link the different poles of the food chain, and less structural actions aimed at establishing alternative modes of production and consumption. One of the consequences of the economic crisis and the austerity period that followed is that food mobilization developed rapidly and did so in a way that made the boundaries between distinct forms of activism increasing permeable. But making sense of these mobilizations and their interactions requires flexible analytical instrument to go out from the typologies that are often used in the literature on food movements, which can lead the unfortunate distinction, such as that between peasant movements and consumer movements, for example, or local food movement and food justice movement, forgetting what happens in between production and consumption. Numerous associations and cooperatives define themselves as organization of both producers and consumers. Another point that is important in my point of view is that we have to consider that mobilizations assume a variety of configurations, ranging from structured organization to informal networks and forms of collective engagement. Such movements, moreover, operate in a number of spheres at the same time, so that an economic alternative that a movement may advocate also is likely to be a political and social alternative, and democratic forms are reassessed through their associated economic relationship and vice versa. Another point is that one of changes. Associations and movements can change over the time, as can relationship among organization members and their orientation toward the organization and its goals. I take the example of the Unilever factory in Gémenos near to Marseille that has been studied by Florent Berliou in its PhD thesis, discussed some months ago, defended some months ago. In this factory, I don't know if you know these case studies, in this factory during 1,336 days of protest and occupation, workers engaged in the definition of their project of taking over the factory. But they also defined the relationship among working men and women, union activists, long-term employees, never employees and temporary workers, and all of them had different relationships with the factory and the work. So the mobilization that was a struggle to keep the factory in the hands of the workers became also a way to rethink relation between all these category of people inside that, and to rethink the power relations between them. But inside this mobilization, individuals can have specific and sometimes divergent visions while remaining part of the group. At the end of the mobilization in Gemenos, for example, there were a lot of fewer workers engaged in the occupation than there were at the beginning. So this suggests that we should pay attention to the relations within such mobilization and how they change over time, also at the individual level. The internal organization of a movement can generate inequalities in spite of its democratic ideals or the declared absence of formal leaders. The articulation between a movement's values and its organization and practice can produce friction, dissonance, and conflict. And this happens especially when the reproduction of the group and its goals are at issues. For instance, when there are institutional or political changes or the group leaders change. The result can be that the movement and its goals take on a different form, or that they can diverge from what they were originally. So we need to consider that contradictions are part of this phenomena, and attending to the ways these participants adjust to them is useful for revealing the social dynamics of this movement. Another example is that one of the Association for the Maintain of Peasant Agriculture in France, the AMAP, that are association supporting peasant agriculture. Individuals became members of this association for very different reasons, sometimes idealistic, sometimes quite instrumental, but the membership itself produced effects on those individuals, and mobilizations affect the individual's involvement. In a certain sense, this mobilization produces activists in a performative way. In this process, those who may join the movement because it is stylish or out of curiosity or for economic reasons can become more involved with other aspects of the movement, and so change the depth and the strength of their involvement. And casual volunteer can turn into a professional volunteer. We can find the same kind of process, for example, in the slow food movement, who started as an association created by a friend, and over the time it included, it became more and more complex, including a foundation for biodiversity, a commercial structure, a publisher, a private university, and became more and more professionalized. So continuing to recruit voluntary, it has become, in a certain sense, as a real enterprise. And over time, the increasing size and complexity of the association led to a greater internal division of labor. And it's happened in different kinds of mobilization where employees can change their roles and status, and also their view of the situation. I go back to the factory in Gemenos near to Marseille. The workers can become manager and assume the function of those who previously were the opposition. And after the conflict, the 70, 80 workers who remained and became part of the workers' cooperative project no longer had the same perspective and that they had at the beginning, and the relation with the work, with the internal hierarchy, with the means of production, or with the production itself changed. Not only the mobilization changed them, but the project in which they engaged at the end of the conflict continued to modify those perspectives and requires adjustments and compromise in daily routine and also in economic and political aims that they had at the beginning. So it's, in my point of view, it's important also to analyze how alternative projects are renegotiated over the time. How does this dilution that sometimes we can observe operate at the scale of the mobilization and at the scale of individuals? And because mobilization and the people who are part of them change over the time, to analyze them, we need to take into account the process and the connections that are part of this change. And we need to situate them, the mobilization, in their social, political, and cultural context, as Ida underlined yesterday, thinking to Paris mobilization, to Nuit Debout. Another point that I would like to underline is that one of the scale of action in mobilization. In some cases, association and movement are really local, and actions are limited to regional and to a restrict level. In other cases, groups operate at a national or international scale or serve to connect transnational networks of diverse movements. And even when the scale of action is limited, even to a space as small as a site of production or a group of consumers, the objective of the mobilization need not to be, but can include goals that are much more extensive. When the workers at the Unilever factory in Gemenos were thinking to their project of creating a cooperative, resuming the production of herbal teas, they met with workers from the Vioma factory in Greece that had been taken over by workers. And on the other side, because they wanted to increase the use of natural flowers, they established links with the producers of lime tree of linden in Provence region, encouraging them to increase their output. So environmental motivation were mixed with those of preserving the factory and jobs, and with the goals of revitalizing neighboring local economies. So different issues that were not all there at the beginning of the mobilization, but that appears during the time. And these alert us to the fact that teams and struggles can grow and migrate from one place to the other. So as idea can circulate and be appropriated, also forms of mobilization can do that. And the networks and connections between the seats of various mobilization became sometimes platforms of political exchanges for various lengths of time. This can lead to alliances, sometimes temporary or situational, and other times more structured and stable. And networks that result can function as autonomous organisms. Attention to the way that mobilization change over the course of time can help us to see also the changing relationships that movement may establish with other institutions. Opposition, conflict may coexist with political and economic negotiation, or can produce collaboration with other institutions that formerly were considered the movement's enemy. I go back to the French Association for the Maintain of Peasant Agriculture that I mentioned previously. They became larger, and becoming larger, they begin to pay their staff. In order to find the way to finance, to pay these employees, they started to establish relations with local elected officials, with institutions, including those on the other side of the political fence. This happened also to the slow food movement during its growing process. They started to negotiate with power that were situated also on the right side of the political arena. Concerning the experimental dimension of this movement, and going to the experiment that are linked to food production, food distribution, and food consumption, some of them are responses to material changes in food production, such as the appearance of genetically modified organisms, or the reduction in farmland, or changes in agricultural prices, or the question linked to food sovereignty. Others reflect concerns with quality and traceability, or the condition of workers, defending quality and small-scale agricultural production. One question is how these objectives are realized in practice. Some of these mobilizations seek to replace conventional commercial farming with methods identified as biodynamic, permacultural, organic, and sustainable. Others emphasize the organization and the economics of production and distribution by questioning classical power hierarchies and through the collective ownership of means of production and worker cooperative. In some cases, more direct exchange between producer and consumers is emphasized, and the social dimension of exchange became a value in itself to preserve or to reintroduce when it seems to have disappeared. But also at this level, some paradoxes appear that are produced by this objective when they face the practical realities. Mobilization seeking a more democratic food system may decide, for example, to eliminate commercial intermediaries in distribution and instead have direct transactions between producer and consumers. Doing away with intermediaries, however, does not mean doing away with all of the work that they do. Volunteers may be willing to compensate for the absence of distribution professionals. And in these cases, producers' work is valued in the same way as the volunteers' works, as it is described in different case studies. I am thinking to the Greek cooperative studied by Theodoros Rakopoulos, for example. If we are to understand this mobilization, so we must also analyze the tension and contradiction that these experiments produce and the way that people deal with them. How many time I have? Five. Okay. So, direct relationship, voluntary work, bartering are all cases where social relationships are valued and seem to develop in opposition to market relationship. The commercial dimension seems becoming secondary, sometimes even hidden, when compared to the ensemble of other values that intervene in the construction of economic values of goods produced and exchanged. Nevertheless, the market relationships reappear or are never completely eliminated. This is illustrated, for example, by the movement in Spain that emerged after the financial crisis to protect people from the ill effect of the financial system concerning mortgage on people's homes. These movements directed attention to mortgages in the ways that they were advertised and sold, but also they highlighted the undesirable effects of financial and property speculation and of the logic of financial practices and the effect of mortgage debt on the life of people in general, as Palomera work show, or also Quentin Ravelli, the nice film about the brick in Spain, film and book. So organization in that broad movement engaged in concrete action aimed at intervening in foreclosure, at cancelling the debts of those who had lost their homes, and at trying to find new ways to house people, in overturning the power relation and moving the responsibility for dispossession from borrowers to banks, their speculation and their financial and commercial practices, the movement cast itself as a form of practical opposition to the effect of financialization. However, these organizations did not question the concept of private property in housing, the modality of access to home ownership, nor did they question the type of economic that real estate speculation had fostered. So to go through the hand of my presentation, what about money? That is the object also of the case study of Sardex later. In some economic alternatives, money seems to disappear, or it is reinvented as an object and a special means of exchange. In other cases, money is the focus of attention, perhaps in the forms of a product's fair price and the fair remuneration of producers. These attitudes are the two sides of the same coin, in which money is either obscured or placed openly in the center of the political arena. When mobilizations are concerned with the price of products or the remuneration of producers, for example, money became a vehicle for expressing other concerns and values. I am thinking to the example of Sardinia, Movimento Pastori Sardi, that has been studied by Marco Pizzalis and Filippo Zerilli, which uses the price of milk to urge recognition by regional and national officials of the social and economic role played by shepherds. In the case of the Association for the Maintenance of Peasant Agriculture that I mentioned previously, on the contrary, money seems to disappear during the weekly distribution of vegetables, because the association members negotiate contract with farmers. We are paid in separate transaction, and money doesn't become apparent during meeting between farmers and voluntary advisor, or when people come to take their vegetables. So it seems that money need to disappear to put in the center of the relation the social dimension of the transaction. So to conclude, we should to consider both these movements that look like successes as vehicle of change, and also those that look like failures, asking when a movement ends, for example, what happened afterwards. We must ask not only how mobilizations themselves are modified and evolve over time, how they reproduce themselves or fail to do so, but also we need to ask how this process affects the individuals involved. The spaces of experimentation in forms of resistance or alternative economics are also spaces producing new social, political, and economic imagination and new social configurations. Property rights, work relationship, exchange, representation, and democracy all are tested and re-examined. So we need to study the place of alternative at the core of the dominant economic system, avoiding the temptation of thinking in terms of types of movement, but thinking in terms of connection, evolution, tensions, and instabilities. Finish.
Thank you so much, Valeria. So now we We have about 25 minutes to 30 minutes of discussion. Who wants to go first? Can you hear us?
I hear, but with an enormous echo. So probably the best. The best, Amelia,
Yeah.
is probably is that if people ask a question, you can resume, repeat near to the microphone. I close my microphone, probably is better. I close my microphone and I open when.
Okay. Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay, so we're going to have people here, come here to ask questions, okay? So that you can listen to us, okay?
I'm sorry for this disagreement and.
Okay, Alexandros wants to know whether throughout your research you have identified some distinctive features that these movements that you have studied have. Okay, yeah, that's it.
But I think that, Alexandros, you are asking also about the changes from the past. Is that? Okay. So if we, well, I don't want to enter in this kind of dichotomies between new social movement, old social movement, because I think that is, from my point of view, is not exactly the right way to take things. If I take the example, two examples. The example, for example, the example of the factory that I evoked, studied by Florent Berliou in his PhD thesis, what you can observe there is that the mobilization that the workers started in 2000, it was 2011, if I'm not wrong, and it was a protest during 4 years, almost 4 years, so it was very, very hard for the workers. What is interesting, if you observe it now, is that workers arrived to this protest without any idea of a collective of workers. In the sense that the factories and the industrial work during the time had produced a fragmentation of the workers. Also, if the labor union were relatively strong there, they were strong because they had to have bad condition, good condition of work, but in reality, the factory direction had produced really a fragmentation, an enormous fragmentation and individualization of the workers that you can observe less in previous period. So the movement faced to that, and so when they started, they were absolutely not a collective of workers. They were people who were afraid to lose their work, individual people afraid to work. And the ethnography that Florent Berliou has done on this mobilization shows all the the go and back of this creation of something common, losing a lot of people. Sure, because this is the other side of the coin, in the sense that in this kind of mobilization, not all the people are inside, and a lot of them go out, answering positively to the action of the direction of the factory that want to eliminate the workers, not to give them any power, nor money nor power. Money probably, but not power. So this is something seems new, in the sense that people are faced with other kind of problems. You can observe the problem of work, but the situation is not the same, because we are in a neoliberal system and another example that I can give is that one of the place of individuals, in the sense that when you observe, for example, what slow food movement try to do, or also this kind of association that I evoked, the Association for the Maintain of Peasant Agriculture, you have this interesting mix between the collective dimension. We need to be together to be more powerful, to change the economy, to change the world. But at the same time, there is a big evaluation of the place of individuals, in the sense that the individual can be sure collectively, but individual need to have the responsibility of the change. Susanna Narowski said that this attention to the individuals is something that is really in the neoliberal logic. At the same time, in this mobilization, this evaluation of the individual action is all the time linked to the collective dimension. So you have this mix of individuals and collective that seems something taking forms that we can observe today and probably not 30 years ago.
So if someone wants to add something, as long as you're loud, I won't have to repeat what you're asking or you're commenting.
I really enjoyed it. It was really, really thoughtful and made a lot of important distinctions and theoretical approaches. I wondered just on the, can you hear me? Should I move?
No, we can't hear you.
Sorry.
Could you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I just wondered, with some of these examples that you gave, and you said that you need to look in the future at some of the consequences. And I wondered with I don't know the factory in, was it in Marseille? You know that. I don't
Near
know
Marseille.
the consequences. How much did they change? How much politically effective in the long run? Or what, even if it wasn't a success, the long run changes that you mentioned. Could you tell us more from different examples?
Okay. Concerning these two examples, that one of the factory, what changes the Gemenos factory that is near to Marseille, they could have a good echo of their protest, because when they started, it was there was the Hollande election, the presidents of France, and so they could benefit of this political environment. At the end of the protest, what they created, Florent Berliot has not analyzed what happened after the occupation, but what is happening is that workers have created a cooperative of workers. So they are the owners of the factory, and they have restarted the production. What changes, if we compare the situation before the occupation and now, they restarted a production that is more nearest to the product, for example, in the sense that the workers, just before the occupation of the factory, they did infusion with chemical products. And so now they have restarted a production using real plants, for example. And also in terms of organization inside the factories, some of the workers are now, what's the term in English, are now employees, the hierarchy they have created are a little bit different from the previous one, when Unilever was there, because this was an Unilever factory. At the same time, the difficulties for them is that they need to face with the market. So they are in the same logics to take a place in a competitive market, and so compromising every day with some of the values that they have defended before. If we look at the other cases, for example, the AMAP association that I studied directly, the Association for the Maintenance of Local and Peasant Agriculture, they changed also over the time. They grow and then they stopped growing. What changed is that the idea of the local, for example, change. Local is something that is more and more ethical than a geographical notion. And the other change is that the initial project that was a little bit rigid in its form, I cannot enter in details, but the way in which they have planned the relationship between the producer, the vegetable producers, and the consumers was really, really rigid, with a lot of constraints for consumers and for producers. In the practice, they are trying to do things that are less ideological and more, they try to adapt and to create some kind of links that are very interesting to observe, that are other kind of solidarity links, different from that one that the project put in advance, but it are links between producers, for example. This kind of association valorize the solidarity relation between producers and consumers. What happens in practice today is that there are more links, more solidarity links between producers than the first example of the association had imagined. So what I want to say is that we cannot imagine the same kind of development for this experimentation. This is not only in the sense of compromise with the market, but most of all, we can observe different kind of adjustment with the market system and with constraints appearing from the experimentation itself in its relation with the rest of the society. I don't know if if it was clear, and if I answered.
It was clear, and I understand that we can't predict, that different things come out from the experience that you cannot tell at the time. And I had a question with the workers at University. I know that's not your own research, but just if you know, in the long run, did they change, like you say, the women, there was a change in the hierarchy. Did they include immigrant workers? Did they change the relationship between like casual workers and the more stable workers? Were those kind of issues that you raised that were,
yes,
were recognized, were they changed when the workers then made it into a worker cooperative? And how did they, in the long run, how did they work these things out?
I try to answer you. If you look at the struggle, when the struggle started, the condition of the workers inside the factory were very different, because you had small contract workers, workers that were there since dozens of years, workers coming from another factory owning to Unilever that closed in the north of France. So you had different also worker history inside the factory, and at the individual and from a collective point of view. So when the struggle started, there was all these heterogeneous people involved with the closing of the factories. What happened during the time is that some of them, decided to find a work in other place, and almost the half of the workers decide to resist, and they continue. They create this group of workers who are today at the basis of the cooperative. Who created the worker cooperatives. But when the worker cooperative has been created, they had started also to employ people from outside, in the sense that not all the workers that work today inside the cooperative are members of the cooperative. So some kind of salary work has reappeared in the factory. I don't know, I cannot answer you about the immigrants. I don't think that there are a lot of immigrants, but please don't take this as absolutely sure, because I don't know the situation from this point of view now. What happened is that you can observe two kinds of workers today. Those owning to the cooperative, that are members of the cooperative, and a smaller group coming from outside as normal salary workers. And from the point of view of people in the cooperative, some of the union leaders are now in the offices. So what they have changed is, I cannot say that they have exactly reproduced the hierarchy that they had before, because one of the aim of the struggle was to be more linked to the real production. People who have started to work with chemical products, for example, were absolutely they have lost the pleasure. They spoke about themselves as people who have no pleasure to work. So the new structuration of the factory has created also new roles. For example, to go and to find herbs, to have links with the producers in the Provence region. So I think that the internal way of functioning has really changed, also to be more effective, more linked, to the new project of the factory. But with this separation between the cooperative members and others, people arriving to work, simply to work. Is it a little bit more clear?
Yes, thank you. Yes, very much.
Okay.
Ciao Valeria.
Oh, ciao.
I have probably a stupid question, because you may have said this and I missed it. But
No,
you mentioned that this cooperative is now running the factory and owns the factory. I'm just wondering, how were they able to buy it from Unilever? Did Unilever gift it to them? How did that happen? Because the factory is not cheap.
I am a little bit embarrassed, because you are asking me question about a research that is done by someone else. No, it's not my own fieldwork on which I can be more detailed, but the history of the struggle is that the Unilever is along, come si dice, un processo. Come si dice, Paolo?
Process.
Paolo?
Process.
Un processo, una procedura giuridica.
A legal process.
Procedure.
A legal process, thank you, a legal process. And there was a link with the municipality where the factory was based. And finally, at the end of this proceed, if I am not wrong, the municipality, Unilever gave the machine for €1. So it was something symbolic at the end. Oh, wow. Unilever was obliged not to, differently from other kind of struggles in factories, the Unilever couldn't take the means of production away from the factory. So they still were inside that. At the end of the juridical proceed, they could rebuy that. But I can give you more references about the work of Florent Berliou, where you can find more detail about that.
Okay, thank you.
If there aren't any other questions, we can proceed to the roundtable now. All right, thank you so much, Valeria.
Probably you can close the video so I can see you. No, don't do nothing. I close the video.
You do it on your end.
Yeah, okay. you do that.
Fai dalla parte tua.
Okay.
Okay.
You can stay connected here on Skype.
Yeah.
You can hear us clearly from the streaming.
Yeah.
Okay? And if you like to...
No, the streaming is not well functioning on my computer. I can listen after, but in direct is not in live is not so.
Okay, I will leave you connected in Skype, and if you like to intervene, I will unmute our microphones and mute them accordingly. Okay?
Okay, but I can eliminate my camera, and if I want to say something, I can restart it, so you can see my face appearing.
Okay,
Huh?
I will minimize Skype, don't worry. Leave it as it is. I will minimize your picture. So.
No, but I can do that. Look at that. If I eliminate my camera, you have only.
Okay.
Hmm?
Okay, go.
Okay.
Shall I go on?
Yes.
All right.
And I close the microphone, so
Yes.
And I open it only if I have questions.
Yeah. All right,
Okay.
so now I call Helen Panagiotopoulos, a PhD student at CUNY, City University of New York, who will be speaking to us about money as unifying spheres of exchange in the single currency.
Okay, so in its aim to deepen solidarity among European states through a shared market and a single currency, the European Union has positioned itself as a federal power in the world economy. It has foregrounded the development of regional trade federations over the autonomy of nation states and supported free market politics. But less than a decade after the adoption of the single currency, which is roughly 10 years ago in the present, a growing sovereign debt crisis in southern European states and a stronger Germany points to a deepening of economic inequality and peripheralization. The notion that the euro is unitary and that by forming a common currency, Europe created a permanent union within the eurozone is further challenged by the proliferation of non-state recognized currencies in southern Europe. In Greece, people rely on the circulation of multiple informal currencies, exchange practices that involve trading goods and services without euros. These solidarity economies have sought to reclaim community resources for local citizens in protest of the staggering inequalities precipitated by Greece's rising government debt, privatization of public assets, and structural reforms. People use local exchange trading practices like barter, time banks, and mutual credit clearing just to survive in the context where coinage is scarce. Given the rise of these experiments in Greece, money is not always the monolithic formation or cohesive instrument it is sometimes imagined to be. My dissertation research inquired into the nature of money, taking existing struggles over the form of monetary value in Greece as a point of departure. The thesis analyzing the research findings addresses how the circulation of multiple currencies not recognized by the state shapes social and political life and understandings of money and value, and how people use local currencies to redefine the boundaries of nation in the context of a single European currency. So my ethnographic fieldwork was between 2016 and 18, even though I had started preliminary research in 2013. But what I moved around Greece to begin with, and what was revealed was that informal currencies are characterized by an astonishing diversity of conceptions of value. So for my dissertation research, I focused on the Exchange and Solidarity Network of Magnesia, which I'm going to refer to as TEM from now on. But some of the multi-sided approach gave insight into the different varieties of informal practices in Greece, like, for example, with time labor currencies like the Athens Time Bank. People abandon the societal valuations of labor by using the person-hour unit of exchange. And then in the case of TEM, or the exchange network of Chania in Crete, they both rely on multi-party clearing, which by allowing what one member owes to another to be cleared against what a third party owns, debits are paid off indirectly. So in this presentation, I'm going to briefly discuss a chapter of my dissertation that connects the larger political and economic project of the EU to the activities of TEM members in the city of Volos. I will explain how members' economic behaviors illustrates the limits of a single currency and describes the challenges of political action that involve commoning by withdrawing from the community of money and by tinkering with the money form. While the TEM scheme uses the medium of mutual credit clearing to combat the coincidence of wants, that's a problem in traditional barter, it also does rely on some of the classic principles of barter that were outlined by Carolyn Humphrey and that in her research were characteristic of the informal systems of contemporary Russia. So at the same time, however, drawing on the concept of spheres of exchange, which was developed by Paul Bohannon in his work among the Tiv of Nigeria, I will explain how goods and services in Volos are valued and organized into distinct categories, enabling members to invest items and gain access to resources from multiple networks using more than one currency. Members of TEM describe three types of transactions: the exclusive use of TEM credits, exchanges using money recognized by the state, or euros, a combination of TEM credits and state money, gifting, and those involving exchange of goods and services, or classic barter. So like all barter economies, the scheme requires that members are more likely to require delays in payment and receiving goods and services than what would happen in a monetized system. So this often necessitates several exchanges before transacting members are able to meet their needs. So exchanges necessitate basic trust at the micro level, as buyers and sellers must wait for returns and rely on trusting that goods and services given and received are of agreed on quality and quantity. The system also encourages consistent behavior, since unreliability often results in ending relations with exchanging partners and searching for new ones. So exchange can take place between unknown people, but for consistent transactions involving valuable items and services, people using barter rely on pre-existing social relations, sometimes based in kinship, friendship, and shared ethnicity. Often, however, there's a poor legitimization of trust in these informal networks, and there are social reasons for this. First, the systems these communities use are both celebrated because of their anti-capitalist or anti-austerity sentiment, yet they are also considered illegitimate forms of exchange. So on the one hand, the European market and its single currency could be perceived as the pillar of progress and modernity or prosperity along Western lines, and the position of Greece as the only Balkan country to not fall under socialism and the first EU member state in the region, that's something that's celebrated, that we don't do barter. But therefore, it reaffirms a European identity and separation from its post-socialist neighbors. However, there is a legitimacy and again, an illegitimacy, so it's also viewed as a return to pre-modern or an uncivilized Greece or a temporary solution during times of financial crisis. Another reason for that is that a lot of these informal markets serve migrant communities from post-socialist countries, and therefore they're linked to socialism and economic failure. However, members of trading networks like TEM use these systems and sometimes use them to reaffirm local identity in the context of European unification. So, the euro is also considered a toxic currency as well, which I talk about elsewhere. So some of the things that members might say is, for example, quote, "I grew up in a Greek village. This is how it used to work in the old days, before money was involved, and this is what we did traditionally. One person would give potatoes for olive oil, etc., and so forth." So the different types of barter that are used are the classic linear barter, which involves when a product moves from a producer to several trades in a linear fashion before it reaches the consumer and then becomes a commodity currency. Also, another approach that's used is the star-shaped phenomenon, where the holder of a less liquid item must go through a number of trades in order to end up into something more liquid or turn into money. So by star-shaped, it goes from the network out and then back in, from informal to formal, which creates this star-shaped image, I guess. So complete barter is something that I describe as being the case in Volos, because it's not only happening at the informal level, it's also happening at the informal level, which Humphrey calls barter everywhere. And I have many examples of this, but I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip them, of the formal creation of currency. Supermarket money, as we know from Alphavita Vasilopoulos, and we can talk about that later. So I'm just quickly going to touch on two case studies for two of my participants, one named Vasily and the second one Penelope. So Vasily is a member of the TEM network. He learned about the currency in 2012. He's a small business owner and a Romanian immigrant since the 1990s. He was forced to close down his fast food shop, move out of his apartment, sell his car for cash shortly after the economic crisis hit. So TEM, he explained, was a very good opportunity for him, and it helped him during a very desperate time in his life. So while Vasilis was an active member in the network, the network was housed in an old municipal building that facilitated a space for the bi-weekly market hours, an office for the project's member support team to perform administrative tasks, and it provided a space to house members like Vasily who needed a temporary place to stay. This was also called the TEM Guest Program. So during his tenure in 2012 until the present, he accumulated a total of 4,128 TEM units and spent 3,754. So the majority of that TEM, 3,268, came from selling his labor in the TEM network, which was the community account which employed him. So he worked in the kitchen, he cleaned and made repairs in the marketplace, and he worked on the agricultural team, which was an on-site communal urban garden that produced different vegetables and foodstuff for the membership. So his remaining credits, which were very few, were accumulated through engaging in manual labor for individual members. So the majority of his credits were spent or put back into the system because they paid for the rent that he paid to the network in order to live on site, as well as for food and clothing. So in contrast, Penelope, who's a non-immigrant pensioner, joined TEM in early 2012 for political reasons. She was a supporter of the Green Party in Volos, and also to alleviate the struggle she faced as a senior citizen who was running a local business and supporting her 2 daughters and grandchildren. So in contrast to Vasili, Penelope accumulated 26,293 TEM during her tenure, and she spent 26,000. So she spent most of them. The main source of accumulation consisted of selling used clothing in the TEM market that she acquired through donations to her charity, a wellness center providing health services, food, clothing, and other benefits to the unemployed from people in Volos, such as people in the neighborhood, churches, and the local government. So the TEM credits she accumulated from these sales were, some were offshored into friends' accounts or family accounts, and others were used to secure more valuable items from the TEM marketplace, which she then sold in her secondhand charity shop in order to secure more resources for the wellness center and to supplement her reduced pension as well. So moving in and out of markets, converting donations to TEM and then from TEM to euros, Penelope was working in and out of markets and converting goods in order to gain access to more resources. So in terms of quickly my analysis, the data generated from the economic activities of these 2 members, we find emerging distinct spheres of exchange, right? The principle that specific types of goods and services are organized into distinct value categories. And this was documented in the 1950s by anthropologists working in Africa, specifically starting with Bohannon, his work among the Tiv, where we see the emergence of a general purpose money, right, which is money as we know it today, and a specific, let me see what it's called. Special purpose money, thank you, where exchange is not neutralized. Like you have money, like even with the introduction of commodity monies into these societies, money obtained, for example, euros, US dollars obtained for cleaning services could not be used for buying food, right? There was a distinction between different types of currencies and what they were used for. So what I'm arguing, or I'm trying to argue in this chapter, is that in the case of TEM, or the Greek case, the scope of informal exchange patterns builds on this scholarship, and what we find is not only distinct spheres of exchange occurring in different networks, but it also is occurring on the individual level based on the positionality or the social position of each member. So for example, for Penelope, the currency of used clothing is what is a resource for her. It's something that was very useful, whereas for Vasili, the currency of labor or the time unit of exchange, the person unit, is what enabled him to eventually get his way out of homelessness, to secure employment, and then to be able to move out of the guest center at TEM and rent an apartment. So these case studies explain that 2 strategic ways members weathered the crisis of debt and austerity. While TEM was created during a period where local people were envisioning an alternative to what was happening in Greece and larger Europe through a local self-sustaining economy that provided its own market, its own means of payment, employment, housing, and urban gardens, the original utopian ideals differ from what the network grew into. While it's maintained the ideal of horizontality, it didn't continue the vision for the commons its founding members started with. It became a social organization that alleviated the crisis, allowed people to get a step up within capitalism, and provided a sense of solidarity within the crash. It reconfigured the class system Yet that configuration of class provides a sense of solidarity and change, right? For example, it gives women a leg up as they have more access to the resources that were highly valued in the TEM network, but maybe not so much valued in larger society. And it also allowed people to survive the capital controls, the massive assault on public assistance, unemployment, and homelessness. So finally, in contrast to the notion that a single currency is unitary, members of TEM illustrate the ways in which the use of multiple currencies create new forms of social organization and solidarity. That's it.
Okay, our next presentation is entitled The Alter Politics of Complementary Currencies, the Case of Sardex, and is by Alexandros Kioupkiolis and Paolo Dini.
You start. Okay, with the notion of alter politics. I start with the notion of alter politics. Yeah. Okay, please. Okay, so in this paper derives from a research. Okay, this paper sums up a research that Paolo has mainly conducted. Paolo is doing research in Sardex, but also he works with Sardex as an employee and collaborator of them. And our question was how we can understand Sardex, which is a complementary currency. Paolo will explain in greater detail what it consists in. So we approach it as a mode, a form of alternative politics. And the reason is this is done within the context of the research project of Heteropolitics. The reason was, the idea behind this framing was that we are interested in exploring and bringing out different ways of doing politics that can be transformative, but are not captured by the conventional understanding of politics. So an introductory part of the paper is about, I will briefly present, is about this notion of alternative politics. In order to grasp Sardex as a form of political action, and not simply as some kind of business or a complementary currency, we need an enlarged understanding of politics. Conventional politics is associated, especially in modern Western societies, is associated with public office, government, the state, the political system. However, throughout the 20th century, starting perhaps with the work of Carl Schmitt, there has been a movement, both in political theory and in political action, a movement away from this emphasis, this exclusive focus on the state and government and the political system. Carl Schmitt, for instance, became famous for his conception of the political as a friend-enemy relation, an antagonism. There have been several other approaches to the notion of politics and the political. Among others, in the 60s, we had new social movements like the feminist movement at the time, which argued that there is a strong political dimension in what is usually understood as personal life. Hence, the feminist motto, the personal is political, which implied that there are political dimensions to private life, that power relations shape life in marriage, in the bedroom, at work, and so on. From the 60s onwards, there have been many attempts to imagine and practice politics beyond or outside the state in a variety of fields, from sociology and political ecology to anthropology to social movement studies and to what is now considered post-structuralist French philosophy. I'm referring to philosophers such as Deleuze and Guattari or Michel Foucault. My main point is that despite this diversity of ideas and their divergences from state-centered notions, we can find a common thread among these different approaches to the political, which include the more standard understanding of politics of the nation-state and Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy antagonism to the personal politics of the second-wave feminism or to the micro-politics of Deleuze. In all these cases, politics refers to social activity that deliberately intervenes in existing social relations, structures, and subjectivities in order to intentionally shape them by either challenging them, transforming them, displacing them, managing them, or even defending them against challenges. From this broader and larger understanding of the political activity can take place both in the formal political systems and underneath, outside, against, and beyond political systems, on any level, micro, meso, or macro scale of social life, in more or less institutionalized and visible social spaces and relations in any social field. In this mode of deliberate collective action on social structures and subjectivities, the political includes both the management of collective affairs by governments, as well as ordinary face-to-face social interactions and attempts at coping with everyday problems. The conception that alternative politics that we deploy in this paper resonates more specifically with Gibson-Graham's understanding of the politics of economic possibility and their theory of social formations that underlies this idea of the politics of economic possibility. This is a conception that has been inspired, in the case of Gibson and Graham, by second-wave feminism, whose local, decentralized, and uncoordinated grassroots action brought about wide-ranging social transformation by beginning in the here and now without a prior large-scale systemic revolution. In the words of Gibson and Graham, and I'm quoting, a politics of possibility rests on an enlarged space of decision and a vision that the world is not governed by some abstract commanding force or global form of sovereignty. This does not preclude recognizing sedimentations of practice that have an aura of durability and the look of structures. It is rather to question the claims of truth and universality that accompany any ontological rigidity and to render these claims projects for empirical investigation and theoretical revisioning. From this angle, non-capitalist or non-mainstream capitalist practices such as Sardex, which usually, I quote Gibson and Graham, languish on the margins of economic representation, end of quote, can be brought to light and seen as coexisting in different ways within the ruling capitalist economies in internally diverse economic contexts. The alternative politics of possibility suggests the ever-present opportunity for local transformation that does not require, though it does not preclude, and indeed promotes, transformation at larger scales. Possibilities multiply along with uncertainties, and alternative practices are affirmed as a foothold to build upon so as to advance broader economic and social change, questioning the assumption that there is a global system of power that must be addressed and broken apart before local transformative action occurs and gains traction. So I will stop here with this discussion of alternative politics. And you will use mine? No. Ah, okay.
Okay, shall I say that Paolo has 3 minutes? Or? Okay.
However long you want. So raise your hand when I should stop. Okay, so yeah, having such a short time, I cannot explain what Sardex is. I can only give some meta comments, and then maybe we can go into greater depth later. But so maybe I could start just by saying that Alexandros mentioned a broadened view of politics, and I think in my mind that mirrors a broader view of economy that I discovered in 2011 in the field of economic anthropology, which I did not know existed before then. I view complementary currencies as an instrument that better reflects this broader conception of economy. maybe then the next thing to say is how is Sardex political? And here is where the collaboration with Alexandros has been extremely interesting for me, because I was aware of his view of anthropolitics from a few years ago, but together we negotiated how this could be applied to Sardex by proposing that Sardex is an expression of two types of anthropolitics. One that we could consider, we could call micropolitical. It would be bottom-up, based on the face-to-face, here and now types of dynamics that Alexandros just explained. And the other one, which is actually the politics of technology of Andrew Feinberg and similar philosophers, who, which is essentially and necessarily top-down, because the platform, the Sardex platform, is an electronic platform. Therefore, the modes of interaction, the rules, and so forth are set by the platform itself, and therefore by the designers. And therefore, then we can recognize these two levels as taking place from a longitudinal perspective in two different ways. The top-down approach or perspective was strongest at the beginning when this system was designed. So think of this as a design perspective. Consciously designed to have certain characteristics and not others. This was a way to invent and design a currency that is not, as has been said earlier this morning, toxic like the euro, but purposely more socially oriented. This type of intervention and, let's say, contribution was strongest at the beginning and is gradually decreasing over time. Alternatively, and this is what attracted Alexandros to Sardex in the first place, is the fact that the consciousness of the users, of which there are now 3,200 small companies, was not at all political at the beginning, with the exception perhaps of some Sardinian independentist feeling, which is certainly present throughout the circuit. But as the circuit grows in size and continues to support this local economy, and as the users become increasingly aware of the social dimension, this second micropolitical aspect of the system is becoming stronger over time. And in the long term, we hope that it will result into some sort of, let's say, cooperative structure or legal entity, or partially owned by the users themselves, in order to reclaim this economic space, not only in terms of market concepts, but more fundamentally in terms of financial concepts and in terms of the medium of exchange itself. Is that okay?
Thank you very much.
Would you like to add something about how through Sardex communities reclaim the power of creating money as social construction?
Yeah. So this is the politics of technology aspect at the root, is the fact that, and this is not an invention by Sardex, Sardex is based on the VIR system. It's sort of an emulation of the early version of the VIR system when there was still zero interest on all balances. But the main aspect of the reclaiming of the power by the economic agents is the fact that in mutual credit, the creation of money is distributed to each agent. So in this case, it takes the form of the ability of each company to go into debt. Money, from a sociological monetary theory point of view, is debt. When it isn't, for example, Bitcoin, problems ensue, okay? So let's say, normatively speaking, money should be debt. Of course, it should not be debt to the level that we have seen in recent crisis and securitization processes, etc., which is a point that Mary Mellor makes, a well-taken point. But ontologically speaking, money should be debt because money and debt are, because debt is a social relation between the debtor and the creditor. So the ability to control this and to distribute this control is fundamentally important because as Schumpeter said, the headquarters of capitalism are in the ability of banks to create money just by scriptural money, but just writing it down in somebody's account. The fact that they have that power has been distributed in a mutual credit system to the economic actors. So that is fundamentally, from a political point of view, the most important innovation. There are many, many other things that we could discuss from sociological, economic, financial, and political viewpoints, but maybe later.
Okay. So our last speaker for this morning's session is, our last speaker for this morning's session is Yeoryios Stamboulis, who will be speaking to us about commons or clubs, ideas from the world of knowledge.
Good morning. Okay, where do I come from? For the last 30 years, shall I imagine? For the last 30 years, I've been preoccupied and looking at the self-governance movement in production, and especially worker cooperatives. And I've been focusing on that for the last, let's say, decade more pertinently and more laboriously. And my other scientific research interest is the economy of knowledge, and through innovation, evolution, and through these interests I've been studying in the realms of let's say, heterodox economics, and that's where I come from. I'm not a political scientist or an anthropologist or a social scientist in the other types of social scientists. I hope that I do observe the discipline of economics in a social science mode and not a quantified mode. Anyway, looking at the evolution of the economic system and society and the mode of production, I have come to the, let's say, preliminary conclusion that a move towards an economy of knowledge gives rather an advantage to the cooperative mode of governance in production, and through that a radical transformation of society. So, in the last couple of decades, we've been also looking at the rise of the discussion of commons after Ostrom's book. And in 2008, Ostrom and Hess wrote a book about knowledge as commons. And that was quite encouraging. And we've been looking at that book. But then trouble began. And I hope this moves some way. Oh, there. But, okay. In her book, Ostrom and Hess, they reproduced a previous well-known figure about how to distinguish commons from other types of goods or institutions, let's say, because it's not only the good, it's the institution. So in that sense, and if you look at it, what is a commons? A commons is a community, in essence, but also a community attached to a resource. And the issue is sustainability, because the community can manage the resource in a way that is subtractable, but at the same time it cannot exclude others or its members from abusing the resource. So this is the problem of the tragedy or the sustainability of the commons. Is knowledge such a type of resource? In this figure, they show different types of institutionalization of knowledge assets or goods. So libraries are supposed to be a common pool resource. Why? Because you could possibly exclude others, but it's not that easy to exclude from a digital library. But is there a problem of abuse in the digital, because the discussion of knowledge and the commons has come up with the evolution of digital technology as well? I don't think it's easy to exclude people, but it's also the digitalization has solved another problem, the problem of subtractability, of once you use the resource, then others can't use the resource. To put the long story short, Ostrom says that actually they're talking about information rather than knowledge. And the fact is that knowledge is not the same as information. Knowledge is more than information. Knowledge is more social. Knowledge is more situational, organization-specific. In that sense, there is an element between commons and knowledge, but the tragedy is quite reverse. It's that not participating in the generation of knowledge leads to the resource depletion, if we could say, rather than using the knowledge. Using the knowledge does not create a problem. Not using the knowledge, not partaking in the knowledge processes is what is causing the problem. Then I reached the conclusion that knowledge is a club good. Why is it a club good? Because you can, up to a point, use it as much as you like, and this is not to the detriment of the other members of the club, of the community. But there is an element of exclusion, of specificity. Knowledge is not free, as much as we would like it to be. It's only neoclassical economists that think about knowledge as something free, that is, that learning is costless. Learning is a social process. Learning is a process of initiation. Learning is a process that entails costs, and it's an active rather than a passive process. In that sense, you cannot say that you can be a member of a knowledge club just by saying, okay, I've subscribed to the journal or to the library or to the repository of the information related to that part of knowledge. I cannot be, I see George, a friend there, an organic agriculture producer, just because I've read his books. It doesn't work like that. I have to be initiated in that. I have to engage in collaboration, transaction, although I don't like that term that much. In any way, I have to be embedded in that social context. And leading from that, we came to the preliminary conclusion that we can address the issues of cooperatives and in general collaborative schemes and collectives rather than clubs, more than as commons. And these might give us an idea about what an agenda would be when we treat collectives as clubs. Okay, before going to that, I have to say that in the economics literature, clubs have been connotated with a rather conservative approach. That is, for instance, we have congestion in roads, then we create a tolled road, like we have Attikiodos in Athens. which is a club good. So only people who pay can go in that. So it's a form of governance, different. So while the other one is a public good and suffers from congestion, this is, they called it impure public good, and they call it a public good or special public good. I think we could take a more radical approach to club goods, a more transformative approach, and see how club goods can be an avenue of transformation. In order to do that, I looked at another discourse in the economics of knowledge. There is a sociological approach to knowledge, and this has come from the disciplines of education and vocational learning, and this is that treats knowledge in the context of communities of practice and says that learning requires participation, and that learning is a process of legitimate peripheral participation. Now, what does this mean? It means that in order to learn, you have to be accepted. You have to be an active participant in the process of learning, and it's peripheral, not in the sense that someone else is in the center, but it's that always, everybody is peripheral to that process, and both the learner and the sort of teacher or coach or mentor, because you're at the center when you do the practice. It's a praxis learning. You learn by doing, and you just don't learn because you theorize. And if you know the theory, it doesn't mean that you know how to do things. Okay, and this is quite common when we try to do things. If that is the case, then clubs are actually communities. So I would say that there could be a convergence between economics, sociology, and anthropology, and economic anthropology, in looking at the mechanics, the structural elements, the relationships in clubs, and how clubs are institutionalized and governed. We have, in the literature, different types of clubs. We have member-owned clubs, cooperatives, commons, collaboratives. We have privately owned clubs, the cinema, the video club, the golf club, and we have state-owned clubs, the university, the research center, for instance. So these are different types and modes of governance of clubs that, in order to understand them, we have to go inside the club, look at the relationships, look not only at the transactions, because it's not just an element of transaction, it's an element of the power relationships, the relationships of governance, of control, and ownership in and within the club, but also across clubs, because clubs are nested, they're structured in society, and they form relationships between each other, where I belong to the club of my department as a knowledge club, which belongs to university, as a governance club and club of allocating resources, which is owned by the state, which belongs to the club, let's say, of the nation or the tribe or whatever. So we could make, first of all, if not a dichotomy, at least the characterization of clubs as to the element of how active participation in decision-making and in the engagement of its members is, how passively or actively members engage in the activities of the club. And we were thinking that success, let's say, or proliferation and the sustainability of the clubs is not just an element of abuse. It's an element also of participation. So it's not just knowledge that needs participation. Unions, as strong as their members participate actively in the activities of the union. If members don't participate, then there is a delegitimization of the union, and the union becomes weaker. And the same happens with different aspects of processes, types of clubs, types of collectives, and so on. So the element of inaction or is an element that characterizes more than just the knowledge club. It's a characteristic that all other types of clubs. And there are elements that economic theory can give us that we can address. And we can address them and look at them in a more interdisciplinary way. First of all, because it could give us a way beyond methodological individualism, because until now we've been taking individuals within collectives, organizations, society, but a very important element of clubs is identity. It's the sense of belonging. And so we form identities and we form our value sets and also our existential, perhaps, way of being in the sense that we always belong to a club. And I keep saying that because, 10 years ago, around this time, the Nobel was awarded to Elinor Ostrom and Oliver Williamson. Okay, Elinor Ostrom, I believe everybody here is quite familiar with. Williamson is very famous in in economics and especially in the discipline of the theory of the firm. But Williamson has a famous quote saying that in the beginning there were markets. And listening to that during a seminar that we had again, I noticed that and I said, no, in the beginning there were clubs. We are born in families, it's a form of club. We are raised in tribes, in communities, in neighborhoods. And then we may engage in the market transaction, but markets come after communities. So let's say, the agenda of the community and the economics of the community could be facilitated by the economics of club, could give us, a research agenda about the sustainability of collectives more as clubs rather than commons, in terms that it's more realistic, and I would say that it's more prolific. I would say that sometimes the discourse on commons that forgets the initial definitions in public economics that Ostrom and others have indicated would leave us to naive or quite unrealistic expectations. I don't have probably the time to go into all these issues here, but I would go straight to the policy issues or the political issues. So one is, how can we develop clubs? That is, instead of having a policy of developing individuals or networks, developing clubs means developing collectives, facilitating the development of collectives, lowering the barriers of inclusion, and perhaps this will come into contradiction with economies of saturation, of overcrowding. So we need to have also a mode of governance between clubs in a structured form of social interaction. So we need also to address the economics and the political economy, to be more fair, of inter-club interactions. And when we do that, then we come to address other things. I was thinking again about these issues during the previous two talks. How do we address issues about allocation, reallocation, redistribution, and accumulation? Because in order to do that, we have to go into a collective sense of ownership. And this means that the agenda is transforming the clubs. We're going back, perhaps, to transforming the relationships, the production or ownership relationships. But this is the essence, that it's not just about the institution, it's about the relationships that form the basis, the DNA of these institutions. And in this sense, we can view, let's say, the ecology of clubs in the sense that there is a competition between different types of clubs, clubs that are based on sharing the club and clubs that are based on more hierarchical, private ownership forms of governance. I think I've helped the discourse. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we have about 25 minutes for discussion. Θέλετε να έρθετε και οι υπόλοιποι εδώ? Okay.
I have a question for Pablo. Paolo, yeah. I was wondering if you could perhaps say more on money as debt that can be regulated and controlled by people rather than central banks. Specifically, one of my questions is, how does the ability to control money as debt alleviate the inequalities that emerge from the fetish of money or the fetish of the money form and what it actually represents, which is social labor?
So we need an additional structural constraint for this to work. The money that's created as debt in Sardex is not convertible. So that's rather important, because if it were convertible, then it could become a target for speculation, currency speculation, or similar activities. The second structural aspect, which is very important, is zero interest, because that can lead to power asymmetries between debtor and creditor. So your question again was how? Can you tell me your question? Yeah. Yes.
So today, I guess we're talking about money as debt, whereas you also have commodity money, which is a representation of social labor, which masks the inequalities associated with work, how we work in our social relations. That was my question.
Okay. All right, so I would say the two structural aspects, zero interest and non-convertibility. Money as debt, as I understand it, is simply an acceptance of, an acknowledgement and acceptance of the responsibility of the social relation that is associated with this financial instrument. If you acknowledge that it is a form of debt, then you can't get away from the fact that it is a social relation. And that comes with its own set of implications, consequences, and responsibilities. So I would say that neoclassical economics, by not recognizing some of these properties, have constructed for themselves a very good alibi. Because then all of these unpleasant consequences are decoupled from their conception of money. So money as commodity can be understood in two different ways. One is cigarettes as the commodity that is being exchanged, as a form of money, or the money itself has a price. Okay, that's the rate of interest. That's the problem. That's the root of the financialization. And not by itself. You also need processes of institutionalization, which essentially provide a multiplier, a scale multiplier, from the individual action and perspective to the scale of institutions. The upscaling that Ida was talking about yesterday is a consequence of the institutionalization processes. Those are not necessarily bad, But if you seed them with a toxic social construction, such as the fiat money with interest and possibility for speculation, then you create monsters.
Basically, my questions will direct towards Helen and Valeria also, and has to do about contradiction in general, because I heard with much. It was very interesting, the speech that Valeria did, and about the what can I say? No occupation, about the different type of organization of labor in the factory that Unilever had, which is something that I didn't know as an example. I knew only about Viome. And in some points he mentioned that I won't refer to workers, I will refer just to people. And for me, this is an idea that, okay, and from yesterday's conversations and speeches, I mentioned that sometimes we push ourselves in a point that we connect many different types of movements or collective actions, or sorry, my English are not so good, but I mean that we make an image that it's not so clear. We make our reality sometimes, because for me the basic oppressive force is capital. Whether we call the people or we call them workers, the oppressive value is there, the oppressive force is there. And that seemed to me a little contradiction, because she didn't want to talk about new social movements or social movements of the past, but for me I see the same oppressive force there, and the same collective action in terms of solidarity between workers to occupy a factory and to make different types of production and so on, and distribution of the product. That's one contradiction. In general, when we see the new social movements and we have to familiarize with it in terms of make it a theory. And to Helen, it's not the question directly to Helen, but to the contradiction we face being here, because TEM, because I was familiar with this, was hosted or was facilitated in a place which was an abandoned place. It used to belong to the Ministry of Agriculture or something, and then the University of Thessaly took it. And afterwards, a plan came in for new university infrastructure. And the university decided to evict this place and to demolish it. Okay, which was not only the place of TEM, it was the place of a housing squad and a cultural center for me as being in the squad, Termita squad. So this for me is a contradiction because in this conference it seems that the university, and at some point it will be correct, encourages those types of alternative currencies or commoning or so on. But on the other hand, we shouldn't have blind eyes to what an institution as a university connected to the state does to some collectives like TEM or like Termita or like other commons, collectives, so on. For me, I can't put blind eyes to it, not only because I took active part on it, but because I see it near me. So, okay, I will finish now. Yeah, the point is that if you see the decrease of TEM, because personally I see a decrease in the TEM collective, and that is, if you connect this decrease to the TEM collective after the demolition. Sorry, yeah, it was a little bit long, but I will. Yeah, the question, not the question, but my point is that sometimes we we see and we allocate different types of collective action, and we have to make it a theory, and we forget our theoretical tools from the past, which are not so old. We see the oppression of the state, of the capital, of the... We see the forces there, and whether we call it people or workers, I mean the force of the oppression is there. Okay.
Emilia?
Yes.
The question was for me because I had...
Yeah.
The audio was completely cut. So can you resume me the question? I'm sorry, really sorry.
Okay. Okay.
In a very short, sorry, because I had also the stream live, so it was completely confused the sound. I'm sorry.
I will try to do it, but if it's not what you said, you can correct me. Okay, you can jump in and go. What he asked was like, you didn't want to speak about new social movement theories or all social movements, and he's wondering why you're doing this since the structures are still there and there is oppression of capital and everything. Why were you hesitant to speak in those binary terms, right? Is that correct? Okay.
In binary terms?
Yes, like new social movements, all social movements, that's what I mean.
I didn't use this category. It was my answer to I hope that I am understanding the question. I'm sorry, not easy in this way. It was only my answer to Alexandros' question when he asked me if there was any kind of continuity or change between past movements and contemporary movements. I don't use this kind of categorization. What it's important for me is what I was trying to express in my intervention was that any kind of typologization is a little bit foreviant, dangerous, in the sense that, in my point of view, what we have to observe when we analyze social movement or mobilization, first of all, is not to separate, not to distinguish between social movement and other kind of mobilization that are sometimes less visible, that appear in the interstices of the economic and political system. So this was my first point, and then that we have to observe their transformation, not to link or to separate them from past movements, but to avoid to fix them in incorrect typology on the contemporary. For example, my example was that one of the movement around production and consumption of food. In the literature, very often you can observe analyses that separate peasant movement from consumer movements. And in this way, my feeling is that we recreate typologies that are not so useful for the anthropological analysis because they avoid us to observe what really happened between these movements, what really happened in the daily life of this movement, often jumping from one topic to the other or trying to link them in different ways. So my point is that we need to situate this kind of movement in their current political and social context. What is happening, for example, in Catalonia cooperative is something similar to what we can observe in a MAP association in France, but at the same time, you have differences that are linked to the political history of these two countries and to the context in which this cooperative appears. So also what they are facing is not exactly the same, and they are doing that in different ways. So for me, what is useful is to have a comparative, a comparative point of view, allowing us to find common points, to find difference, not necessary to produce new typologies, but to try to observe transformation, links, connection between these movements and difference. Sure. I don't know if I have answered to your question. I am really sorry. It was. Yeah. Okay.
I completely agree with the contradiction that you pointed out about the takeover of the site where TEM was housed, and also the two anarchist groups that were also housed there. The way that I see it is that it's the trend that we've all talked about of the assault on state resources is what the example of what happened at the site Stapalya is basically, the state, an example of the state assaulting community resources, and the huge contradiction in that the destruction of Termita and TEM and Libertad under the premise that the university wants to create a community center for the students, right? Whereas there was already a community center in place, right? And also the way that I analyzed this in my dissertation is that if you look at previous things that have happened in Volos, there is a trend where the university does destroy these pockets where communities are coming together and creating projects. So it's not like it hasn't happened before. And there was another question I think you had, or is it? Oh yes, there's definitely. So with the destruction of the TEM site, TEM has activity has been declining over the years, and with the destruction of the marketplace, that really deepened that decline. However, it's also given an opportunity for the TEM network to take a moment and reflect on what it's done in the past 9 years, and to learn from from the experiment of TEM and its reconfiguring to start up again with adopting new measures so that it's more successful.
Okay, so thank you very much for all the papers. I had a question. I'm very interested in the Gibson-Graham that Alexandra mentioned. And I've used Gibson-Graham, who talk about I think you said politics of possibility or something like that. And the idea that there are moments within capitalism where they could be transformative. I think that's the whole idea behind the commons and things like that. But I've been very criticized in seminars because they don't address issues of class, and because it's seen as a way of, like, for example, some cooperatives can be exclusive, some cooperatives, that's why I asked Valeria that question about the factory. And so I'm wondering how you might see that, Alexandra, or how that might pervade some of these questions about the ways in which Gibson-Graham, or the ways in which ideas of the commons sometimes don't address the inequalities of class, or may perpetuate them in some ways, and how that might be addressed.
Okay. I'm not sure that I agree with this critique of Graham and Gibson, because they do talk about class. It's not that I didn't bring it up because it was not part of the, I didn't have time anyway. But they see class in different ways. That's something that is under construction, reconstructed at the time. And they have introduced at several points, especially in their later work, different criteria in order to be able to evaluate different communities and the different forms of economic activities in communities. So issues of inclusion, exclusion, hierarchies, and so on. So they are focused on this criteria without at the same time trying to set up some kind of very rigid typology, because they are very interested in the dynamics of transformation. That even originally closed, let's say, or exclusionary cooperatives can become more open gradually. So it is a question of being able to perceive and to assess these dynamics. But they do have such criteria, and these are the important things. I mean, and of course, taking into account that this is something that they emphasize, and I think it's very important, the question of impurity and hybridity. You cannot have like something absolutely pure under the current conditions, or perhaps the perfect commons, or I don't know, the fully egalitarian society, community, and so on. It's always a degree of degrees of impurity, and these are practical questions that need to be examined using values and the criteria of evaluation. I don't have much. Of course, they need to be addressed in practice. I mean, in these communities themselves. Can I ask a question to Yeoryios before?
Thank you very much. It's to Helen. I have to say that I'm interested in issues of viability, of longevity of the commons. So from that point of view, I would like to ask your perspective on the TEM. I mean, do you approach the TEM as an experiment, or just that something that happened and just go now? And if not, I mean, I would like to have your opinion on if you have any data, how many people have comprised the TEM during the year? So how many people have activated, how many users use the TEM, and how was this evolution of the TEM? I mean, how long it lasted?
So one of the things that the organizers described as a problem for TEM was that it came out of a time when the crisis hit, and because of that, in the case of TEM, a lot of local businesses were closing down, right? They were going bankrupt, so people were taking their merchandise and taking it to the TEM market, which caused a big bang, right? So in 2012, when the TEM marketplace was put in place, it was massive because there were all of a sudden there were all these resources, and everybody saw an opportunity to be able to get resources without euros, state money. So
do you have an idea how many actual were? About 1,000?
Yes, it was around 1,500. In terms of active members, it was more like 400. And today we have about 25 people that are active. However, I do not say that TEM is dead or dying. TEM is still working, right? There are people that need it and that use it daily. Okay, I don't think that it fits into the anthropology of decline, because if you follow around the members and the few members that use it, you'll see that it's a very important part of their lives, and it provides resources for them that they otherwise wouldn't be able to get. So going back to the crisis, so it created a real challenge where people saw it as an opportunity, and once the crisis sort of started settling, and then all of those resources that were coming out of the businesses that had shut down were disappearing, then people were not finding the things that they needed. And so the political aspect of TEM, right, which is thinking about how to change the political consciousness of people, was lacking, right? This is where there needed to be some sort of I don't want to say seminar, but some sort of a political training that gave the membership ideas about how to organize themselves separate from what was going on in the crisis, right? How to create resources from within the TEM community. But there has definitely been a decline. But I think that in terms of the people that created TEM and the people that have followed it through to and use it to today, to the present, it still is a very important part of their lives.
Okay, this is for the last paper. Thank you very much for this discussion. I was wondering, I mean, if I understood well, you argued that knowledge is not commons, at least in Nostrom's terms, because it involves exclusions. So it is more like a club good, because club goods tend to be exclusionary in different ways, to different degrees. Anyway, so I take this point. I mean, I think you're right that knowledge involves several exclusions, and communities of knowledge are communities of practice that come with several exclusions at the time. The thing is that, however, that perhaps somebody from Ostrom's perspective could reply that even if this is so, Ostrom's theory of the commons, the original and about natural common pool resources, is again about communities that exclude members. So it is not, excludability itself is not cannot be the only criteria to say this is a club good or not, or a common good, because the communes that she studied from Switzerland to Japan and so on, they were closed communities. They had clear, I mean, the clearly defined boundaries of the community and the good is one element that defines the natural common pool resources. So I just want you to respond to this.
Yes, I agree that the resource is always connected to a community, and I don't think that you can treat commons just as a resource. You have also to address the social aspect of that. But while the community is trying to manage the resource, its inability to exclude from the resource, it's what creates part of the tragedy. The other is policing or managing its members. So, for instance, let's say fisheries in the Aegean. It's okay. You may have the collective of fishermen saying that we are going to observe certain practices, sustainable practices of fishing, but someone may come from outside the community, fish, not observe the practices, and it's very difficult to exclude him. The same comes with pollution and things like that. It can't happen with knowledge, because you can't learn if I don't accept you in the publishing community, if I don't engage with you in my discourse and so on. So it's quite impossible to say that, you know, I know all that others know and can engage in the discourse unless I am sort of accepting the community. And in that sense, I also disagree with the notion of open collaboratives. I think that this may lead to non-sustainability in two terms, in terms of congestion, let's say, but also in terms of participation and finally legitimacy. We have these problems with not with worker cooperatives that much, but with producer cooperatives like agricultural cooperatives in Greece, which they tend to work like, you know, société anonymes. They have a chairman, there's a hierarchical function and structure, and in the end they end up with the agency problem similar to, you know, stockholding firms. So we need to address, you know, what exactly is the ontology of the communities, of the collectives, because if we don't do that, then we're not going to be successful and have a productive policy. And I would also like to engage with the issue about the site in Pallia and Termita. I think there are two issues. First of all, the misrepresentation of the issue, because it's not about building a social club, it's about, for students, it was about building university buildings for departments. So the question is, who decides? Who is legitimate to decide what's going to happen with public resources? And the other issue is that, just for your information, the university had offered that collective to rent them a place to house their activities. Okay?
That has not come into fruition yet. Okay.
Okay. All right then. So let's conclude for now. Hope we will see you all back at 4 o'clock.
Bye. Have a good lunch.